Hi everybody. Look, it was quite a pleasure to be asked to celebrate a birthday party for Reading Australia, and I'm delighted that I was asked to do that. And I'd like to begin by also acknowledging traditional owners of the region and to pay my respects to elders past and present and those of Indigenous Australians who may be present here. It's slightly difficult for me because in the haste to run out and get here on time, as it was I was over half an hour early, I came out without my glasses. These belong to someone who's standing in the room. Let's see how they work. So far so good, but I've done all that bit ad-lib. Okay, as most of you probably know, I'm a writer, and I write for the very young and for young adults as well. And I also write books about writing for those who teach creative writing to kids and for those adults who'd like to write for young people. And let me tell you, there is an enormous market there. But more importantly, in this context, I was the nominee from the Australian Society of Authors to the board of the Copyright Agency, as it was then the Copyright Agency Limited, or CAL, from 2000 to 2014. And during that time, I discovered what a huge organisation it was, but more important, how hugely significant it could be. Because although it's there to collect monies and pay out that which is due for the copying of creators' work, and I hope you all realise we're not just talking writers and illustrators, we're talking photographers and editors and surveyors and probably others that I'm not aware of, but all those who have intellectual property which is being accessed and then used by those without payment. Well, I kind of knew enough about that, but what I didn't know was that there was also the Cultural Fund. It wasn't hugely significant prior to my joining the board, and that has nothing to do with my joining of it, but it became enormously organised and very significant in the past, say, 15 or so years. When the crisis hit about whether or not enough material from Australia was being studied in schools and universities, there was a bit of an outcry. You might remember the media, I think particularly the Australian, wasn't it, who screamed loudly and ran those big dramatic headlines. Schools and universities weren't using Australian material, and the works which did merit selection on many occasions were either out of print already or were cast aside because teachers did not have the resources to effectively use them in their classroom practice. The practitioners who cared about it were also extremely distressed, but they were not in a position necessarily to do things. So, enter Brian Johns. Now, Brian's been lauded a bit already today. It's not really night, is it? And I would like to add my comments to that. I think his idea about Reading Australia was absolutely wonderful. He had a broad policy brain, honed at the ABC, at SBS, and at Penguin Books. And I thoroughly concur with Zoe's comment that this was a brilliant idea. He was he was already the chair of the Copyright Agency itself, but he also was chair of the Cultural Fund at this stage. And he could see that with the passion that he could devote to it, we could enhance the availability of Australian books, Australian stories, and Australian creators. And you don't have to be a writer to value Australian stories. Brian, like so many others, and probably like all of you here, believed that to know a country, to understand your own country, that self-knowledge comes from the culture that you are immersed in. And that means the literature that we read, the film and television we watch, and all those other aspects of the lives we lead, from the high art down at the Opera House to the Denny Ute muster. And our kids need to grow up having that world valued in their books, validated in their books, in print and on the screen. Stories, whether they be about bunyips or barbecues or pavlovas or simply a Christmas in the middle of summertime, and so much more, just as I had Enid Blyton, snowy festive season, currant buns and lashings of lemonade. Come on, you all read the 2, 6 and 7 in the favourite side, didn't you? It was Brian's idea that the Copyright Agency should put up, as Zoe has said, books for exposure and development, and titles of value would have resources available free of charge, so that teachers and lecturers would have those resources they wanted and needed. I thought it was a fantastic idea on two accounts. First of all, as a board member, I could see that we were now servicing our members in a new and creative way. But as a writer, I felt it was one way to address that which had been a major problem for us. It wasn't just a problem for teachers that they weren't having the resources to use, it was a problem for those of us who wrote or who illustrated, who created the works and saw them disappearing in an incredibly short time. We watched the influence of our stories taking second place to those of somewhere else. And I say that quite confidently because, like anyone here who is my age, and looking around there actually aren't that many of you, maybe you'll get there in a few years' time, we grew up on the books of Great Britain and the United States of America. And that is not to say that we shouldn't read the works of other lands, not to say that at all. But for that to be almost the only works that we are educated with is a serious problem. I meant to bring with me this evening the book Save Our Stories, a small booklet that you should have got yourself either in the mail or in bookshops in the last month or so, written by a whole range of people and distributed by the book industry. It contains works, and I'll refer to it a bit further on too, works that are responses to the Productivity Commission's current reviews, and I was struck by a sentence or two in the work of Monica McInerney, who said that she grew up, as I had done, reading the stories from other places, and she said, "I knew more about Mark Twain and the Mississippi River and Enid Blyton's English woods and islands than I did about my own country." It felt rare and thrilling to find a story with Australian settings, characters and lives. And I can only agree with her. But I would add to it not just Britain and North America, but also the Canadian writer L.M. Montgomery, Prince Edward Island and Anne of Green Gables. Though, mind you, that was probably published in America. I did read Australian titles, maybe you did too, the Billabong books of Mary Grant Bruce and Seven Little Australians and others of Ethel Turner. As Australian titles, yeah, they were a treat. What I didn't know then, and only discovered years later when I became a management committee member at the Australian Society of Authors, those titles were published in England, and those writers, and others like them, were treated to a colonial royalty. Here in their own country, with their books read by their own countrymen and women and children, those books were treated as if it were an overseas title and they were paid a reduced royalty. Motivation goes down. So those of us who are now senior citizens, I have a card to prove it, not to mention a gold Oz card, Oz whatever it's called, what is it, Opal card, another sign of the incoming dementia. We were raised on a diet of the other stories, but kids now have an absolute wealth of stories written and published here, homegrown material. And we have a publishing industry that is vast and profitable, and the books we write, whether for children, young adults or adults, are published internationally. So why weren't they the bulk of books being studied? As the others have said, the complex reasons, there's many to go into, but prime amongst them was the lack of resources. You had to be young, energetic and single with no desire to have a life outside work if you wanted time to create material. Hopefully there weren't too many of them. And as Zoe says, the idea was fleshed out and the work began. And that first task of choosing the titles fell to the Council of the Australian Society of Authors. As a former chair of the ASA, I happened to be on the council and so was one of the group that sat down to make that initial choice. And Nadia Weekly's here as well this afternoon. She was part of the team, as were many others. We wanted books that had literary merit, that were of interest, but certainly that would reward more intense study. They were the values that we tried to uphold. And we wanted to value books that were highly valued in the reading world, in the reading community, and that would be able to reveal much if they were further studied. Some books leapt onto the list with little difficulty. Cloud Street by Tim Winton's a good example. So was A Fortunate Life by Bert Facey. And in the younger readers area, Looking for Alibrandi by Melina McKerra was a natural, and My Place by Nadia Wheatley and Donna Rawlins. Older titles for the young included Ash Road by Ivan Southall and Seven Little Australians by Ethel Turner. That one's ubiquitous. Some books really selected themselves, as I say, and others were argued over long and hard. And as Zoe said, it's a pity we didn't keep notes. I can only remember the most salacious ones. But we never actually got to fisticuffs or the hurling of obscenities, as I recall. But as I said, my brain's starting to go, so who knows? I'll talk to you later, Nat. Since that first meeting, the list has grown enormously. I looked at the work before I wrote what I'm saying today, and in the fiction section alone, I was thrilled to see there are older works by people like Henry Handel Richardson, Patrick White and Frank Hardy, through to works written more recently by Christos Tsiolkas, Michelle de Cresta, Charlotte Wood and Melissa Lukashenko, and that's just scratching the surface. And it wasn't just fiction. Works by poets like Rosemary Dobson and Faye Zwicky, Kate Jennings, Francis Webb, Bruce Dorr, Les Murray and Dorothy Porter, and playwrights like Ray Lawler and Louis Nara, Jack Davies, Hannie Rayson and Dorothy Hewitt. There is so much there, and there's been enormous effort being put into the creation of resources, from lesson plans to my personal favourite, which are the essays that have been written to accompany the secondary texts. And there's a terrific increasing use of Reading Australia. It's doing pretty well for a 3-year-old. As I think it was Adam said, there are more than 7,000 subscribers and well over 1 million hits since the late part of 2013. Teachers are able to find resources in the context of the whole New English curriculum, and their feedback is excellent. I liked seeing a note saying that it was varied, layered and enriching, and another that it was absolutely great for the time poor. One of the best outcomes for the writers whose work is up there on the site is the sense that the titles are being more used, not just read. It's anecdotal, but in my own case, a book that I feared was going out of print this year has just been re-released in a 10th anniversary edition. Books out of print were a huge lamentation for writers back then. And another colleague of mine, also here in the room, says that a title she has on the list has now started paying royalties again after years in decline. And she attributes that to Reading Australia and resource availability. I referred to Save Our Stories a moment ago, that small publication. It's in response to the Productivity Commission's recommendations to the government that they remove the restrictions on parallel importation of books, that is. The argument is that that would bring down the price of books. But what the book industry fears, and we believe the fears are well-founded, our publishing industry would be brought down as titles that are popular bestsellers would be published overseas and dropped into the Australian market. And the opportunity for us to trade our works in different markets would be removed, therefore removing a whole aspect of the economy that we can expect. And many young writers would never be able to begin. Without a healthy home publishing industry, many Australian stories would never reach the page. The children now would be back in that world of my childhood. The arguments against the Productivity Commission's recommendations are exactly the same as the arguments for the development and continuing investment in Reading Australia. Stories matter, and Australian stories matter to Australian people. It doesn't mean that I and others like me have to write about kookaburras and gum trees, although the odd one, like possum bloody magic, does creep in. But Australian voices telling tales of life in our towns, our cities and our rural areas, and what is going on inside our heads are really, really important. We should honour it, we should celebrate it. So happy 3rd birthday, Reading Australia. May there be many more to come.